The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the walls themselves were screaming. I was halfway through signing a trade agreement when the lights in my office turned red, and the door sealed itself shut without my command. My name is Edward Miles, and for 6 years I had served as the human ambassador to the Threll Compact, a union of 9 star systems that had only grudgingly allowed my species a seat at their table. I had learned their languages, their customs, their endless patience for procedure. Nothing in 6 years had prepared me for the sound of my daughter screaming through the comm link clipped to my wrist. Her name was Naira. She was not born to me. She was Ithari, a species with skin like brushed silver, and eyes that changed color with her mood, and I had adopted her 4 years earlier, after a political purge wiped out her birth clan in a single night. The Compact had allowed the adoption only because refusing it would have embarrassed them in front of the wider galaxy. Privately, half of them thought a human was unfit to raise an Ithari child. That night, I stopped caring what they thought, because all that mattered was the sound of her voice breaking apart into static. I ran. The corridor outside my office was already thick with smoke, not from fire but from stun grenades, the kind designed to disable without killing, the kind used by people who wanted their targets alive. Embassy guards lay across the floor, breathing but unconscious, their weapons untouched, still holstered. Whoever had done this had not given them the chance to reach for them. I reached Naira's room and found the door already open, not broken, opened, cleanly, by something that understood our security systems better than we did. The room was empty except for her small shoes, left neatly by the door the way she always left them, and a single data chip resting on her bed, like it had been placed there for me to find. I picked it up with shaking hands and slotted it into the reader on the wall. A voice filled the room, modulated, stripped of any accent that might identify a species. It spoke in compact standard, slow and deliberate, as if enjoying every word. It said that humanity had been given a seat among the stars far too soon. It said that a species so sentimental, so attached to its offspring and its wards, had no place making decisions for star systems. It said that Naira was proof that humans could be reached through what they loved, and that this was only the beginning. It said I had 6 days before the terms of her release would be sent, and that any attempt to involve outside forces would end badly for her. I did not feel fear in that moment. I felt something colder and steadier settle into my chest. Something I would later understand was the exact feeling every human parent has felt since the beginning of our species. The feeling that turns ordinary people into something the rest of the galaxy has never had a word for. I sent one message. Not to Compact Security, not to the peacekeeping fleet stationed 2 systems away, not to any of the diplomatic channels I had spent 6 years building. I sent it directly to Earth, through a private channel reserved for exactly one purpose, a channel I had hoped I would never need to use. Within 11 minutes, I received a reply. It contained no words of comfort, no promises, no questions about my well-being. It contained 4 words. The 9th is coming. I did not know then what those 3 words meant to the rest of the galaxy. I would learn soon enough. For now, I sat in my daughter's empty room, holding her small shoes, and waited. The Compact's own investigators arrived within the hour, moving with the slow, careful precision of a species that valued process above urgency. Their lead investigator, a tall being named Korvath with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond across his face, informed me gently that Compact protocol required 72 hours of internal review before any cross-border pursuit could be authorized. He explained that the kidnappers had likely already left Compact territory. He explained that acting too quickly could damage delicate political relationships with neighboring systems who might be sheltering the perpetrators. He explained a great many things, and I understood that every explanation was another hour added to the 6 days I had been given. I told him that Earth would not be waiting for his review. Korvath tilted his head in the gesture his species used for confusion. He told me, not unkindly, that humanity had no standing forces in this sector, that our fleet presence in the entire quadrant consisted of a handful of trade escorts and a single diplomatic cruiser, that whatever I believed was coming would arrive too late to matter, if it arrived at all. I did not argue with him. I simply waited. Word of the kidnapping spread quickly through the diplomatic quarter, the way bad news always does. Other ambassadors came to offer condolences that felt more like curiosity. A Vantiri delegate, a species known for their obsession with genetic lineage and inheritance rights, asked me pointed questions about Naira's birth records, about whether her disappearance might be connected to a dormant claim on Ithari territory that had gone unresolved for 3 generations. I told him I did not know. He did not believe me, and something in the careful way he studied my face told me he knew more than he was saying. A Kolru trade representative, softer spoken, offered to loan me private security contractors at a discounted rate, the kind of gesture that in Kolru culture meant genuine sympathy, and in every culture meant an opportunity to be owed a favor by the human ambassador. I declined as politely as I could manage. By the second hour, the Compact's internal news networks had already begun circulating a theory that humanity's response, whatever it turned out to be, would be reckless and disproportionate, further evidence that our species was too unstable for the responsibilities we had been given. I found it strange, sitting there in the wreckage of my daughter's empty room, that so many powerful and intelligent beings were more concerned with what my grief might look like than with finding her. I thought about the first time Naira called me her father. She had been shy about it for months after the adoption, unsure whether the word translated the way she meant it, unsure whether a human ambassador really wanted an Ithari orphan attached to his name and his career. I remembered the night she finally said it, quietly, almost like a question, watching my face to see how I would react. I had not said anything. I had simply pulled her into a hug, and she had understood that as answer enough. I thought about all the small things, the way she insisted on watching the sunrise from the embassy balcony every morning, because Ithari eyes could see colors in human sunlight that human eyes could not. The way she had taught herself to read Compact Standard and English at the same time, mixing the 2 languages into a private dialect only she and I understood. The way she had asked me, only a week earlier, whether humans and Ithari would ever be considered truly equal in the eyes of the Compact, and the careful, hopeful way she had listened to my answer. Somewhere out there, someone was holding her, using her as a lever to pry concessions out of a species they believed would fold under pressure, a species they believed valued caution over its own children. They had made a serious miscalculation. 6 hours after I sent my message, a ship entered the system that matched no registered class in any Compact database. Compact Traffic Control hailed it 17 times. It did not respond to a single hail. It simply moved through the system's outer defense perimeter, as though the perimeter did not exist, ignored 2 automated warning shots from a border patrol vessel, and settled into a stationary orbit directly above the embassy district. Korvath came to find me personally, his 4 eyes wide with something between alarm and disbelief. He told me an unidentified vessel had entered orbit and requested landing clearance for a single shuttle, addressed specifically to me. He asked, carefully, whether I knew anything about it. I told him I did. The shuttle that descended through the atmosphere was small, unremarkable, painted in matte gray, with no visible markings beyond a simple insignia on its hull, a stylized number 9 inside a circle. It landed in the embassy courtyard without requesting further clearance, its engines cutting the moment it touched down, its ramp lowering before the dust had even settled. 5 figures walked down that ramp. They did not move like soldiers on parade, did not move like the ceremonial guards other species sent to impress diplomatic hosts. They moved like people who had done this exact thing 100 times before and expected to do it 100 times again. Unhurried, economical, every step deliberate. The one in front stopped a few feet from me and studied my face for a long moment before speaking. Her name, I would learn, was Grace Bellamy, and she led something the rest of the galaxy had only heard whispered about in cautious tones, a unit humanity called the Ninth, though what came before it in that numbering, no one outside our government had ever confirmed. She asked me only one question. She asked me what Naira's favorite color was. It was such a strange, small question in the middle of everything happening around us that for a moment I could not answer. Then I understood. She was not asking for tactical information. She was asking so that when they found my daughter, they would know how to comfort her, how to make her feel safe again, how to prove to a frightened child that the people coming for her actually knew who she was. I told her. Naira's favorite color was the pale gold of the embassy sunrise. Grace Bellamy nodded once, turned to the 4 people behind her, and said 4 words I would remember for the rest of my life. Let's bring her home. My name is Grace Bellamy, and I have spent 11 years leading a unit that does not officially exist on any Earth defense roster. We call ourselves the Ninth. Nobody outside a handful of rooms and a handful of governments knows why. I have stopped trying to explain it to people who ask, because the answer is simpler and stranger than they expect. There were 8 units before us that failed at the one job we were built for. We were the 9th attempt, and we did not fail. Standing in that embassy courtyard, looking at Edward Miles, I understood something that I had understood many times before in this line of work. Grief does strange things to a person's face. It hollows some people out completely, leaves them empty and unreachable. It sharpens others into something harder, something with a single point of focus. Edward Miles had the second kind of face. That was good. It meant he would not slow us down, asking us to be gentle with our methods. I had 4 people with me. Noah Sinclair, our tracker, a quiet man who could read a trail of evidence the way most people read a book, patient and thorough, never in a hurry because he understood that hurrying led to mistakes. Henry Vance, our systems specialist, who had spent the shuttle ride down already cracking into the embassy's security logs before anyone asked him to. Olivia Marsh, our medic, calm, in a way that made even chaos feel manageable. The kind of calm that came from having stitched people back together in worse places than this. And beside me, always beside me, Ethan Brooks, who had been my second in command for 9 years, and understood my orders sometimes, before I finished giving them. We did not waste time on formalities. While Korvath and the rest of the Compact's investigators were still debating procedural timelines in a conference room 3 floors up, Henry had already pulled every second of security footage from the night of the kidnapping and was running it against every known signature in our database. Noah had already walked the length of Naira's room twice, crouched by the window, and found something the Compact investigators had missed entirely, a faint residue on the windowsill that did not match any material native to this planet. Olivia sat with Edward for a few minutes, not asking him tactical questions, just listening while he talked about his daughter, letting him say her name out loud as many times as he needed to. I have learned over the years that grieving parents need someone to hold that space for them before they can think clearly about anything else. Olivia was always the one who did that best. I stood at the window of Naira's empty room and looked out at the diplomatic quarter beyond it, at the towers and transit lines of a species that had spent centuries believing itself more advanced, more civilized, more capable than the newcomers from a small yellow star. I thought about how many of them, right now, were quietly certain that we would fail, that our anger would burn hot and useless and accomplish nothing, that in the end, this would become another story about human recklessness to add to the pile. I had heard variations of this story my entire career. I had stopped being offended by it a long time ago. What I had learned instead was that being underestimated was, in this line of work, the single greatest advantage a person could have. Henry called me over less than an hour later. He had isolated the moment the embassy's internal cameras went dark, a gap of exactly 40 seconds, during which every recording device in the building had been fed a looped signal instead of live footage. Whoever did this had access to embassy security architecture that should have been impossible for an outside party to obtain. That meant one of 2 things. Either someone inside the embassy had helped them, or someone had spent a very long time preparing this operation from the outside, patiently, methodically, waiting for the right moment. Noah's sample from the windowsill came back from our portable analyzer a short while later. The residue was a compound used almost exclusively in the manufacture of a specific type of grappling equipment, the kind favored by a small number of specialized extraction contractors operating in the outer systems, mercenaries for hire, who did not ask questions about their clients, as long as payment cleared. It was not the calling card of any official Compact faction, which told me something important. Whoever had ordered this did not want their own hands visible. They had hired professionals to do the dirty work and kept themselves safely removed from any direct evidence. That meant 2 targets, not 1. The people who had physically taken Naira, and the person or faction who had paid for it to happen. I called the team together in what had been Edward's office, now stripped of its diplomatic furniture, and turned into something closer to a command center. I laid out what we had. A 40-second gap in security footage that required inside knowledge or extraordinary outside preparation. A residue trail pointing toward a specific class of mercenary contractor known to operate out of the outer rim. A ransom message with no accent, No identifying markers, deliberately scrubbed clean by someone who understood forensic voice analysis well enough to defeat it. Ethan asked the question that mattered most. He asked who benefited from this, not who wanted money, because the message had made no financial demand yet, but who benefited from humanity being humiliated, from Naira disappearing, from the very existence of a human father raising an Athari daughter being proven a mistake. I thought about the Vantiri delegate Edward had mentioned, the one who asked pointed questions about Naira's birth records within hours of the kidnapping. The Vantiri were a species obsessed with lineage, with inheritance, with bloodlines and ancestral claims that stretched back centuries. If Naira's birth clan had held territory or resources before the purge that killed them, there could easily be a dormant claim sitting unresolved somewhere in Vantiri legal records, a claim that would transfer to her, and through her adoption, uncomfortably close to human hands. Henry pulled up what public records existed on Athari succession law, while Noah cross-referenced known Vantiri operatives with any history of contracting Outer Rim mercenaries. It did not take long to find a name. Keith Vorn, a mid-ranking Vantiri noble with a documented and very public grievance against the settlement that had granted Edward guardianship of Naira 4 years earlier. A settlement Keith Vorn had argued against at the time, unsuccessfully, in front of a compact tribunal. It was not proof. It was a thread, but threads were exactly what our unit specialized in pulling. I made the decision that we would move immediately, rather than wait for the compact's own investigation to catch up, a decision I knew would create friction with Korvath and his superiors. Edward warned me, almost apologetically, that acting outside official channels could damage delicate relationships between our two governments. I told him that I understood the risk and had already accepted it before we ever left Earth. What Edward did not yet understand, and what I did not have time to explain fully in that moment, was that our unit did not exist to protect delicate relationships. We existed for exactly this kind of situation, the kind that fell through every gap in official procedure, the kind that other species were too cautious, too calculating, too concerned with appearances to handle quickly. Earth had learned, over decades of contact with species like the Compact, that patience and procedure had their place, but that place was not here, not when a child's life was measured in days instead of months. Ethan and Noah began preparing our ship for departure, plotting a course toward the Outer Rim territories, where mercenary contractors of Keith Vorn's preferred type were known to operate. Henry stayed behind briefly, quietly slipping a tracking countermeasure into the embassy's communication systems, in case whoever was watching Edward decided to escalate before we returned. Olivia packed medical supplies with the efficient calm of someone who hoped not to need most of them, and prepared anyway for the possibility that she would. I found Edward alone in the courtyard as we prepared to leave, standing where the shuttle had landed hours earlier, looking up at the stars, as though he might see his daughter somewhere among them. I told him what I could without overpromising, because I have learned that false comfort helps no one, and true comfort has to be earned through results, not words. I told him that we did not know exactly where Naira was yet, but that we knew where to start looking, and that starting was the hardest part in situations like this. I told him that our unit had a reputation, not because we were louder or angrier than anyone else, but because we did not stop, not for procedure, not for politics, not for anything, until the job was finished. He asked me, quietly, why Earth had built a unit like ours at all. It was a fair question, and one I had been asked many times by people from other species who genuinely did not understand. I told him the truth. Every species in the Compact had learned to survive by calculating risk, by weighing the cost of action against the cost of inaction, by treating even their own children as variables in a larger political equation when the stakes grew high enough. Humanity had never fully learned that lesson, not completely, not in the place that mattered most. We built the ninth because somewhere along the way, our species decided that some things were not negotiable, that some losses were not acceptable, no matter the political cost, and that the galaxy needed to understand exactly how far we would go to protect the people we called family. Edward did not say anything for a long moment. Then he asked if he could come with us. I told him no, gently but firmly. I told him that his place, for now, was here, holding the political line with the Compact, keeping our official presence legitimate, while we did the work that could not be done through official channels. I told him that the best thing he could do for his daughter right now was trust us to bring her back to him. He nodded, though I could see how much the answer cost him. As our shuttle lifted off the embassy courtyard and rose into the darkening sky, I looked out at the fading lights of the diplomatic quarter below and thought about Kenneth Vorn, somewhere out there, believing he had made a clean and untraceable move against a species he considered too sentimental to fight back effectively. He had no idea what he had actually started. Ethan sat beside me in the cockpit, plotting the final jump coordinates toward the outer rim, and asked me the same question he always asked before an operation like this one. He asked me how far we were prepared to go. I told him the same answer I always gave, as far as it takes, and not one step further than necessary, but never, under any circumstances, one step less. The engines engaged, the stars outside the viewport stretched into long streaks of light, and somewhere far ahead of us, in territory that answered to no government and enforced no laws beyond the ones its inhabitants chose to respect, a frightened Ithari child was waiting for someone to come find her. We intended to be exactly that. The outer rim territories did not look like much from orbit, a scattered handful of stations and half-abandoned mining colonies clinging to the edges of compact space where official law grew thin and unreliable. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I have flown into more of these forgotten corners of the galaxy than I can count, and every single one of them had taught me the same lesson. The places official governments forgot about were exactly the places where the worst kinds of business got done. Our first stop was a station called Drenna's Reach, a rusting way station built decades earlier by a mining consortium that had gone bankrupt and abandoned the place to whoever wanted to claim it. Now it served as a loose gathering point for contractors, smugglers, and mercenaries who preferred not to be found by anyone official. Noah had traced the grappling equipment residue back to a supplier who did most of his business out of Drenna's Reach, a Kolru merchant named Ressin, who sold gear to exactly the kind of specialized extraction crews capable of pulling off the embassy operation. We did not walk in as a diplomatic delegation. We walked in as four ordinary travelers looking to resupply, dressed in nondescript gear, weapons kept out of sight but never far from reach. Grace had taught me a long time ago that the fastest way to get information out of people who did not want to give it was to never look like you were asking for information at all. Ressin's shop sat in a cramped corridor near the station's lower docking ring, shelves stacked with equipment of questionable legality, the air thick with the smell of engine coolant, and unwashed bodies passing through. Ressin himself was a thin, nervous being, with too many joints in his fingers, the kind of merchant who had learned to read danger in a customer's posture before they said a single word. Grace approached the counter first, casual, unhurried, and asked about a specific type of grappling line, describing the exact compound Noah had identified from the embassy windowsill. Ressin's fingers twitched, just slightly, a tell he probably did not even know he had. He said he did not carry that particular line anymore, that it had been a limited batch, sold out weeks ago to a single buyer. Olivia leaned against the counter, friendly, disarming, and asked if he remembered who bought it. Ressin hesitated, glancing toward the back of his shop, where a curtain separated the storefront from a private storage area. That hesitation told us everything we needed to know before he even opened his mouth to lie. I did not wait for the lie. I stepped past the counter and pulled the curtain aside, and found exactly what I expected to find: a second set of the same grappling equipment, freshly restocked, alongside a data slate with a partial shipping manifest still open on its screen. Ressin started talking very quickly after that, the way people always do once they realize pretending is no longer an option. He told us the equipment had been purchased by a crew calling themselves the Hollow Vein, 6 operators with a reputation for high-value extractions, who did not usually work jobs involving children, but who had been offered an unusually large payment for this one. He told us the crew had left Drenna's Reach 3 days earlier, headed toward a system called Kessit's Fold, a dense asteroid cluster known for its lawlessness and its usefulness for hiding things that did not want to be found. He also told us, quietly, almost as an afterthought, that the payment for the job had come through a private account registered under a shell corporation with Vantiri ownership. It was not proof of Kenneth Vorn's direct involvement, but it was another thread pulling tight in the same direction Grace had already suspected. We left Ressin with enough credits to disappear quietly before the Hollow Vein or anyone connected to them realized he had talked, and set course for Kessit's Fold. The journey gave us time to plan, and time, in this line of work, was almost as valuable as information. Henry spent the trip building a model of the asteroid cluster from every scrap of navigational data he could pull from public shipping records, mapping out the handful of stable structures large enough to support a hidden facility. Noah studied everything we had gathered on the hollow vein, cross-referencing their known methods with past jobs attributed to them, building a picture of how they operated, how many people they likely had on site, what kind of security measures they preferred. Grace spent most of that time in quiet conversation with Olivia, going over contingencies, the kind of details most people never think about until they desperately need them. What to do if Naira was injured, what to do if she was too frightened to trust us immediately, what to do if the extraction turned violent before we reached her. I spent my time the way I always did, before an operation like this, running through worst-case scenarios in my head until I had a plan for each one, because the difference between a mission that succeeded and one that failed almost never came down to luck. It came down to preparation, and to the willingness to adapt the moment reality diverged from the plan. Kessit's fold turned out to be exactly as chaotic as its reputation suggested, a dense field of tumbling rock and debris that made sensor readings unreliable, and navigation genuinely dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with its patterns. Henry's model, built from limited public data, had narrowed our search to 3 possible structures large enough to host a holding facility. We could not afford to search all 3 without alerting whoever was watching, so Noah suggested something simpler and far more effective than a brute force search. He suggested we let them find us first. We drifted our ship into the outer edge of the asteroid field, powered down to minimal signature, and waited. Noah had learned, over years of tracking dangerous people in dangerous places, that crews like the Hollow Vein maintained perimeter watchers, low-profile scouts who monitored approaches to their hideout and reported anything unusual. If we made ourselves just visible enough to draw attention without appearing threatening, patience would do the rest of the work for us. It took 6 hours. Long, quiet hours where every member of the team kept themselves ready, without letting the waiting wear down their focus. A discipline Grace had drilled into all of us over years of operations, exactly like this one. Then Henry's passive sensors picked up a small, unregistered craft drifting closer to our position, moving with the careful, hesitant pattern of someone trying to determine whether we were a threat. We let the scout get close enough to get a good look at us, then Grace opened a channel and spoke directly to whoever was piloting the craft, calm and unthreatening, claiming engine trouble and asking for the location of the nearest station capable of repairs. It was a simple story, easy to believe, and exactly the kind of harmless excuse that would let a cautious scout relax their guard just enough. The scout gave us directions toward a structure buried deep in the densest part of the field, the third of the 3 possibilities Henry had identified, and peeled away without ever realizing what they had actually done. We did not move immediately. Grace insisted we wait another hour, watching the scout's flight path to confirm it did not return to warn anyone, watching for any sign that our approach had been anticipated. Only once she was satisfied did we begin moving our ship carefully through the debris field toward the coordinates the scout had unknowingly given us. The structure, when we finally found it, had once been a mining processing facility, its exterior scarred and pitted from decades of exposure, its original markings long since worn away. But the docking bay on its southern face showed recent activity, fresh scorch marks from engine burns, a maintenance drone still active near the entrance, small signs of ongoing use that a truly abandoned facility would not show. Noah confirmed what we already suspected through careful passive scanning. Heat signatures inside the structure, more than a dozen, clustered in patterns, consistent with a working crew, and at least one smaller, isolated signature that Olivia identified immediately as consistent with a child's body temperature and size. Naira was inside. Grace called us together one final time before we moved. She reminded us of the plan, the entry points Henry had identified from the structure's exterior architecture, the rotation pattern the Hollow Vein's perimeter guards seemed to follow based on the movement we had observed, the priority above all others being Naira's safety, every other objective secondary to getting her out alive and unharmed. She looked each of us in the eye before we suited up, the way she always did, a small habit that had become a kind of ritual over the years we had worked together. It was her way of confirming that everyone on the team understood exactly what we were walking into, and had chosen, deliberately and without hesitation, to walk into it anyway. I thought, as I checked my equipment one final time, about Edward Miles standing in that empty embassy courtyard, looking up at the stars where his daughter had disappeared. I thought about the way his voice had cracked, just slightly, when he described the sound of her screaming through the comm link. I thought about how many species across the compact believed humanity's attachment to family was a weakness to be exploited, rather than a strength to be feared. Kenneth Vorn, whoever he truly was behind the shell corporations and hired mercenaries, had made a calculated bet that humanity would hesitate, would negotiate, would prioritize caution over consequences, the way every other species in the compact had learned to do through centuries of careful diplomacy. He had bet wrong, and in a few hours, he was going to learn exactly how wrong. Grace gave the signal, and our ship began its final, silent approach toward the structure's exterior hull, moving through the debris field like a shadow among shadows, closing the distance toward the place where a frightened child was waiting, without knowing it, for the people who had already decided they would not stop until she was safe again. The engines fell silent as we drifted the final stretch on momentum alone, and somewhere ahead of us, in the cold, dark heart of an asteroid field that answered to no law but its own, the hollow vein continued about their business, entirely unaware that the most dangerous thing in that entire system was already at their door. We entered through a maintenance shaft on the structure's southern face, a route Henry had identified as the weakest point in the facility's exterior security, a passage the hollow vein had likely never expected anyone to find, let alone use. My name is Olivia Marsh, and while Grace led operations and Ethan handled tactics, my job in moments like this was simple: keep everyone alive, especially the person we came to rescue. The shaft opened into a narrow maintenance corridor, lit by dim emergency lighting, the air stale and recycled too many times. Noah moved first, silent, checking each junction before signaling the rest of us forward. We had studied the facility's likely layout from old mining schematics, but old buildings had a way of changing over the years, and Noah's caution accounted for exactly that uncertainty. We encountered our first guard near the second junction, a heavily armed mercenary leaning against the wall, more bored than alert, clearly not expecting anyone to have made it this far into the facility undetected. Ethan closed the distance before the guard had time to react, moving with the kind of efficient control that came from years of exactly this kind of work, disabling him quickly and quietly, leaving him breathing but unconscious, exactly as Grace had instructed. I want to be clear about something, because I know how these stories sometimes get told afterward, exaggerated into something bloodier than the truth. Our unit did not walk into that facility intending to leave a trail of bodies behind us. Grace had built the Ninth around a simple principle that other species consistently failed to understand about humanity. Strength did not require cruelty to be effective. Every guard we encountered on our way through that facility was disabled, not eliminated, restrained, and left secured, because our objective was never revenge. Our objective was Naira, and Naira alone. That restraint, I have come to believe, was part of what made our reputation so unsettling to the rest of the galaxy. Other species expected retaliation to escalate proportionally to the offense, expected anger to translate directly into destruction. What we offered instead was controlled, precise, and utterly unstoppable, the kind of force that could not be reasoned with or negotiated against, but that also did not spiral into indiscriminate violence. It made us harder to predict, and far harder to prepare for. We moved deeper into the facility, disabling 3 more guards along the way, each one falling before they fully understood what was happening. Henry, monitoring the facility's internal systems remotely from a secure link he had established during our approach, guided us around 2 additional patrols we would otherwise have walked directly into, feeding Noah real-time updates through a private channel. Then we reached a heavier door, reinforced beyond anything else we had seen in the facility so far, guarded by 2 mercenaries positioned with far more attention than any of their colleagues had shown. This, Noah confirmed quietly, was almost certainly where Naira was being held. Grace did not rush the approach. She waited, studying the guards' rotation, waited for the precise moment their attention drifted apart just enough, and then moved with Ethan in perfect coordination, closing the distance and disabling both guards within seconds of each other, too quickly for either to raise an alarm. The door itself required Henry's remote access to bypass its security lock, a process that took nearly 90 seconds, each one stretching longer than it should have as we stood in that corridor, aware that any moment a patrol could round the corner behind us. Then the lock released, and the door slid open. The room beyond was small, sparse, lit by a single overhead light, and there, curled into the corner of a narrow cot, silver skin dulled by fear and exhaustion, was Naira. She flinched violently when the door opened, pressing herself further into the corner, clearly expecting more of whatever frightening treatment she had endured over the previous hours. I stepped forward slowly, hands visible, keeping my voice as soft and steady as I could manage, and told her that her father had sent us, that we knew her favorite color was the pale gold of the embassy sunrise, that we were here to bring her home. Her eyes, that shifted color with her emotions the way Edward had described, moved from wary gray toward something warmer as the words settled in. She asked, in a small, cracked voice, if this was really happening, if I was really who I said I was. I knelt down to her level and told her yes, and that we were not leaving without her. That was the moment everything went wrong. An alarm tore through the facility, a deep, pulsing klaxon that meant our presence had finally been discovered, likely by whoever had been monitoring the two guards outside the door and noticed they had stopped responding. Henry's voice came through our comms immediately, warning that the facility's remaining crew was mobilizing, converging toward our position from multiple directions. Grace made the call instantly, the kind of decision that only came from years of experience under exactly this kind of pressure. She told me to get Naira moving toward the extraction point while the rest of the team covered our retreat. I lifted Naira from the cot, feeling how small and light she was, how tightly she gripped my jacket the moment I picked her up, and moved as quickly as I safely could back toward the maintenance shaft we had entered through. Behind us, I heard the controlled chaos of Ethan and Noah handling the mercenaries converging on our position, disabling them one after another with the same precise restraint they had shown throughout the entire operation, even as the danger around us intensified. Grace stayed close behind me and Naira, watching our flank, calm and focused even as the alarm continued blaring through the facility. We were halfway to the maintenance shaft when a man stepped into the corridor ahead of us, blocking our path entirely. He was Vantiri, tall and sharp-featured, dressed not like a mercenary but like someone who considered himself above the mercenaries he had hired, and I understood immediately, from the cold satisfaction in his expression, that this was Kayeth Vorn himself. He spoke calmly, almost pleasantly, telling me that humanity's reputation for recklessness had clearly been exaggerated, that we had walked directly into a facility from which he had no intention of allowing us to leave with what he considered rightfully his. He explained, with the patient tone of someone who believed himself completely in control, that Naira represented an unresolved claim on Athari territorial rights, that her existence under human guardianship threatened to destabilize agreements he had spent years carefully arranging, and that he intended to correct that mistake personally. Naira pressed herself tighter against me at the sound of his voice, and I understood that this was not the first time she had heard him speak since her capture. Grace stepped forward slightly, placing herself between Kayeth Vorn and the two of us, and told him, with a calm that carried far more weight than any raised voice could have managed, that he had made a serious error believing this operation would end the way he had planned. He laughed, genuinely amused, and told her that a single team, however skilled, stood little chance against the resources he had assembled here, resources he had spent considerable money and time preparing specifically to deter exactly this kind of retaliation. That was when Ethan and Noah arrived behind us, having finished securing the corridor we had come from, and Kayeth Vorn's confident expression faltered, just slightly, as he realized the mercenaries he had been counting on to reinforce his position were no longer capable of doing so. Grace told him plainly that he had one opportunity to step aside and let us leave peacefully. She told him that our unit's objective had never been him, that we had no interest in his political schemes or his territorial claims, that our only purpose here was the child standing behind her, and that if he chose to interfere with that purpose any further, the consequences would be entirely his own doing. For a long moment, Kayeth Vorn stood perfectly still, weighing his options the way his species always did, calculating risk against reward with careful, deliberate precision. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, though the fury in his expression made clear this was not surrender, only a tactical retreat. He told us, as we passed him, that this would not be forgotten, that the compact would hear about human forces operating outside every recognized law and boundary, that our actions here would be used as proof of exactly the instability he had always claimed humanity represented. Grace did not slow her pace as she answered him, She told him that he was welcome to explain to the compact why a respected Vantiri noble had personally financed the kidnapping of a child, and let him decide for himself which story the galaxy would find more damaging. We reached the maintenance shaft without further resistance, Naira still held close against me, her small hands finally beginning to loosen their desperate grip, as the sounds of the facility grew distant behind us. Henry guided our ship into position for immediate extraction, and within minutes, we were rising away from Kessit's fold, leaving the asteroid field and everything within it behind us. I sat with Naira through the entire flight back, wrapped in a warm blanket, her silver skin slowly regaining its color, her eyes gradually settling into a soft, steady gold that I understood, from everything Edward had told us, meant she finally felt safe again. She asked me quietly, partway through the journey, if her father knew we had found her yet. I told her that we had already sent word ahead, that he was waiting for her right now, that every minute that passed was bringing her closer to seeing him again. She smiled then, small and tired but genuine, and closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest for the first time since the night everything had gone wrong. I looked across the cabin at Grace, who was watching Naira, with an expression I had seen on her face only a handful of times over the years we had worked together, something quieter and more personal than the calm professionalism she usually carried. I understood, without needing to ask, exactly what she was thinking. We had done what we came to do, but the work of proving why it mattered, why humanity refused to compromise on things like this no matter the political cost, was only just beginning. I was standing in the same courtyard where the shuttle had first landed when I saw them return. My name is Edward Miles, and I had spent the 2 days since Grace Bellamy and her team departed, doing the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, which was wait, and trust, and hope, while pretending in front of compact officials that I was calm and composed, and entirely confident in the outcome. Korvath had visited me twice during those 2 days, each time with the same careful, sympathetic tone, gently suggesting that perhaps it was time to consider what negotiations might look like if the human team failed to locate my daughter, or worse, if they returned having caused an incident significant enough to damage relations between our governments beyond repair. I listened to him both times, thanked him for his concern, and told him I had faith in the people Earth had sent. I did not tell him that my faith had very little to do with confidence in the outcome, and everything to do with having no other choice but to hold on to it. When the shuttle's engines finally cut across the courtyard for the second time, I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the sensation of holding your breath for 2 days without realizing it, and finally being allowed to breathe again. The ramp lowered, and Olivia Marsh stepped down first, carrying a small bundle wrapped in a warm blanket, and even from across the courtyard, I recognized the silver of Naira's skin, the shape of her, the way she immediately lifted her head at the sound of the crowd gathering to watch. I do not remember crossing the distance between us. I remember only the moment Naira saw me and called out, her voice cracked but unmistakably hers, and the way she practically threw herself out of Olivia's arms and into mine the moment I reached her. I held her the way I had wanted to hold her, every single hour since the alarm first sounded through the embassy walls, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed to be said. She was thinner than she had been, and there were shadows under her eyes that told me she had not slept well during her time in captivity. But she was alive, she was safe, and she was here. And in that moment, nothing else in the entire galaxy mattered to me at all. Grace stood a short distance away, giving us that moment without intruding on it, the same quiet patience I had noticed in her the first time we met. When I finally looked up, still holding Naira close, she gave me a small nod, and I understood, without needing the details yet, that whatever had happened out there, it had ended the way it needed to end. The details came later, once Naira had eaten, bathed, and finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep in her own bed, the first real rest she had gotten since the night she was taken. Grace and her team sat with me in what remained of my office, and she told me everything. The trail through Drenna's Reach, the confrontation at Kessit's Fold, the moment Kaeth Vorn had stepped into their path and threatened to undo everything they had accomplished. I asked her what would happen now, whether Kaeth Vorn would face any consequences for what he had done, whether the compact would even believe the evidence against him given how carefully he had tried to hide his involvement. Grace told me that Henry had already compiled everything, the shipping records connecting the mercenary payment to Kaeth Vorn's Shell Corporation, testimony from the Hollow Vein crew members who had been detained, and were now, understandably, eager to cooperate rather than face consequences alone, and recordings Noah had quietly captured during the confrontation itself, including Kayeth Vorn's own words admitting his involvement. It was, she said, more than enough for the compact to act on, whether they wanted to or not. The following weeks proved her right. News of Kayeth Vorn's arrest spread quickly through compact space, and with it, the full story of what had happened, carefully filtered through official channels, but impossible to fully contain. Different species reacted in different ways, exactly as I had come to expect after years of diplomatic work among them. Some, like Korvath, seemed genuinely troubled by what the incident revealed, both about the vulnerabilities in compact security and about how easily a respected noble had been willing to exploit a child for political leverage. He visited me once more, before the matter was fully settled, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not offer careful diplomatic language about procedure or patience. He simply told me he was glad Naira was safe, and that he hoped the compact would learn something meaningful from how close they had come to allowing this to happen. Others reacted with the same wary unease I had noticed since the moment the 9th shuttle first landed in the embassy courtyard, a discomfort at how quickly and decisively humanity had acted outside official channels, at how thoroughly a small team had dismantled a carefully constructed criminal operation without waiting for anyone's permission. The Vantiri delegation, unsurprisingly, protested loudly about the manner in which evidence against Kayeth Vorn had been obtained, though notably, none of their protests managed to dispute the evidence itself. And some, quietly, privately, reached out to me in the weeks that followed, with a different kind of message entirely. A handful of smaller species within the compact, ones who had long felt vulnerable to exactly the kind of political maneuvering Kayeth Vorn had attempted, reached out not with condemnation, but with cautious, hopeful interest, wondering whether humanity's willingness to act so decisively on behalf of the vulnerable might make us a valuable ally rather than simply an unpredictable variable. I found myself, in the months that followed, fielding more of those quiet inquiries than I ever had before Naira's kidnapping, a shift I had not expected, but understood completely once I thought it through. Every species in the compact had spent centuries learning to survive through careful calculation, through treating even their most difficult decisions as equations to be balanced. What Kayeth Vorn had failed to understand, and what many others across the galaxy were only now beginning to grasp, was that humanity operated by a different equation entirely, one where certain losses were simply not acceptable, no matter what the careful calculations suggested. Grace and her team left a week after bringing Naira home, their work finished, called back to Earth for whatever their next assignment would be. Before she left, Grace found me in the courtyard one final time, watching Naira chase a small mechanical bird Olivia had given her as a parting gift, laughing, in a way I had not heard from her since long before the kidnapping. Grace told me something I have carried with me ever since. She told me that the galaxy would spend years trying to understand exactly why humanity responded the way we did to situations like this one, would write reports and analyses trying to calculate the logic behind our actions, and would never quite manage to capture the truth in a way their careful systems could fully process. She told me the truth was simpler than any of them expected. It was not about strategy or reputation or political advantage. It was about the simple, uncompromising belief that the people we call family are worth everything, without exception, without hesitation, and without a single moment spent calculating whether the cost was worth paying. I watched her shuttle lift away from the embassy courtyard for the final time, rising into a sky just beginning to turn the pale gold of sunrise, the exact color Naira loved most, and felt something settle in my chest that had not been there since before the night everything went wrong. Naira ran up beside me, breathless from chasing her mechanical bird, and asked if the team would come back someday. I told her I did not know, but that it did not matter, because we would never need to send for them the way we had before. Not because nothing dangerous would ever happen again, but because now, everyone across the compact understood something they would never forget. Humanity did not calculate the cost of protecting what it loved. It simply protected it, completely, without exception, and without limit. And somewhere out among the stars, in council chambers and negotiation rooms across a dozen different systems, that single, simple truth had already begun to change the way an entire galaxy looked at the small, stubborn, fiercely loyal species that had only recently arrived among them. They had learned, in the end, exactly what I had always known. You do not take what a human loves, not without consequences that reach farther than anyone ever expects.